We'll start now. Good afternoon. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for spending your time this afternoon attending our webinar, Regulatory Affairs for Clinical Trials. Joining us this afternoon is Dr. Salma Michor. She is the CEO of her own consulting company, Michor Consulting. She's also an independent expert to the independent expert to the European Commission and the lecturer at the University of Krems, Austria. This webinar has been developed by Informa Connect and is part of our virtual training program of the same title, Regulatory Affairs for Clinical Trials, taking place end of June 2020, which is a virtual training program where Dr. Michor will be offering the legal and regulatory strategies underpinning the clinical projects globally and with a particular spotlight on Asia. If you would like to find out more information about the above mentioned virtual training program, please do so by following the link being sent to you right now on the chat box, or you can scan the QR code being given to you on your screen right now. Now, before I would like to hand over the presentation to Salma, I would like to walk you through several aspects important to ensure this webinar meets your expectation. First, please feel free to submit along your questions by selecting the Q&A button at the bottom panel so Dr. Michor can address them at the end of her presentation. Due to the limitation in time, we may only be able to address questions with the highest number of votes. So please kindly remember to do an upvote. Next, your comments during the Q&A sessions are more than welcome, and in order to do so, please raise your hand and we will have your vocal transmission enabled, so you may raise your comments. Next, a record of this presentation will be also made available and delivered to you, all the registered attendees, on emails within 3 working days. Now, finally, at the end of this webinar, you will also receive an evaluation survey. Your feedbacks will be very important for us to improve our future webinars. That's all from myself for now. I'm certain you are looking forward to the presentation, so I would like to hand over the mic to Dr. Michor.
Thank you, Tony, for that kind introduction. So I'm going to try and share my screen so that the attendees can see my slides. Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to have a 1-hour session on regulatory affairs for clinical trials with a focus on the COVID-19 situation. So this is a new situation for most jurisdictions, and so I think the information shared with you would be quite interesting. The topics we're going to cover for this presentation is some information about conducting and monitoring clinical trials, legal aspects like data protection, amendments to clinical trial protocols. Also, we're going to take a look at the emergency procedures in different jurisdictions, but I have limited the jurisdictions to the EMA, European Union, the FDA, the US, and China. Just a short comment also on real-world evaluation or data, and some information about digital design for clinical trials. So these are the topics of today's webinar, and I hope you're going to find it useful, and please let me have your questions at the end. So executing a clinical trial in a normal situation is a very complex matter, simply because sometimes you have different sites, you have different teams, and you have it's a very multidisciplinary, cross-functional process where you have different types of expertise, different types of collaborations, and you could have a very complicated situation, especially considering that you may have multi-site trials and multi-nation trials. So you may have trials running in different countries. Clinical clinical trial applications and approvals are unlike drug registrations. Till now, the clinical trial approval process has been pretty much a national approval, even in areas like or regions like the EU, where you have 28 or 27 member states part of the European Union. You still have the clinical trial approval process was still done at the national level. There are some harmonized procedures, like there are some harmonization procedures in Middle Eastern countries, in Asian countries, and also now with the introduction of the clinical trial regulation in Europe, and also for medical devices, some harmonization when it comes to the process of clinical trial application and approval. Nonetheless, clinical trial is a very complex project, and managing and especially international clinical trials is very challenging, and you have to consider many aspects. The regulations in some emerging markets are not as clear and specific as in some other regions like the US or Western Europe. So when you want to roll out your clinical trials in countries in the Asian region or in Asian countries, you would find some discrepancy between the approach used by some countries like Japan, maybe Singapore, maybe South Korea, as compared to other countries like Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, and so on. So this discrepancy makes the management of international clinical trials a very challenging process. You have different timelines for submitting and receiving approval. And also you have to consider, once you have approval, you need to get also approval from the Ethics Commission. Apart from that, you have to also manage your whole recruitment process, and you may have also to deal with the import and export regulations for transporting the clinical samples which you want to use in your clinical trial. The management of a clinical trial in a normal situation is a very challenging situation. And now, with the new situation, with the pandemic situation, you have the management of, number one, new clinical trials relating to the pandemic, or on the other hand, the management of clinical trials which are currently running and affected by the pandemic situation. These all increased the challenge of running your clinical trial successfully. So you have issues like planning and coordination of global trials, which is a very big challenge. And those of you who are working in this area know this very well. But during a pandemic, like we had this situation, our current situation, all these challenges can spike. And you may have a very, very difficult situation to manage a trial which was already running before the pandemic, and suddenly you have a pandemic situation. So the authorities around the world have reacted to this new situation. And for example, you have in Europe, the European Medicines Agency has published a guidance on clinical trial management during the COVID-19 pandemic. This guidance is available on the European Medicines Agency webpage to download. And most of all, it gives guidance on the management of a clinical trial during a pandemic situation. It's not specific for clinical trials addressing the COVID-19 virus. Mostly it covers how to deal with the new situation or very challenging situation that the pandemic presents. As you know, around the world, the regulators or government health authorities have issued different restrictions relating to ensuring the health of the national population. These restrictions, although not specific to the management of clinical trials, does affect the management of your clinical trial. For example, restrictions relating to social distancing, restrictions relating to teleworking, all these restrictions affect directly clinical trials which were ongoing. And the companies who are working in these specific situations have to react very quickly to the changing regulations, because in some countries, the governments have issued type of curfew regulations where the citizens are not allowed to go out. You're supposed to wear specific clothing. You're supposed to practice social distancing. And all of this will have an effect upon clinical trials which are already ongoing. So you have to have a very quick reaction to meet the specific situation in your jurisdiction, and at the same time to ensure that the clinical trial either is put on a hold or is conducted in a manner which doesn't affect, number one, the subjects which are already enrolled in the trial, and number two, your expected results. So the guidance also addresses like actions that sponsors of affected clinical trials should take to ensure the integrity of their studies. Because as I said, these studies, the pandemic hit or affected certain clinical trials, which some of them are addressing the COVID-19 virus. So this is one set of trials which obviously before the pandemic didn't start. But there has been now a very quick rush for companies and sponsors to start clinical testing with drugs, promising drugs they think which could give results for this particular pandemic. And on the other hand, you have to consider clinical trials addressing any other type of disease which have been affected by the situation arising from the pandemic. And so this guidance is very useful if you don't have a specific guidance in your own jurisdiction or your own country. You can always look at guidance from other regions, and this guidance does give you some very good input and suggestions about what to do in this type of situation. In Europe, at least, there were many actors which were involved in putting together this guidance, not only the European Medicines Agency, but also the Good Clinical Practice Working Group, the Inspectors Working Group. There's another group called Clinical Trials Facilitation and Coordination Group. And we have a so-called Heads of Medicines Agency group. There's another Clinical Trials Expert Group. And of course, in Europe, you do have the national competent authorities, 28 or 27 of them. So all of these were involved and gave their input into this. There are two published guidelines. So as I said, if you have a clinical trial running and you don't have any guidance, local guidance, you can always take a look to see what are these international guidelines saying, and many aspects of these guidelines are applicable to any type of clinical trial which is running in any region. So in the Corona era or in a pandemic situation, usually you have extraordinary measures which need to be implemented, and you have to adjust your clinical trials. For example, if you have trial subjects which are already enrolled in a clinical trial, and at the onset of a pandemic, you have to react to the local situation and practice, for example, measures like self-isolation, or you have to put yourself on the quarantine. There may be limited access to public places like hospitals due to the risk of spreading disease. And also the healthcare professionals may not be available. So in certain countries, like in the UK, for example, they had a very high shortage of medical staff. So most of the staff have been assigned to emergency situations. And there have been, for example, many procedures or operations which have been put on hold. And this would be also the case in many other jurisdictions or many other countries. So if you are a sponsor or you are involved in a clinical trial which is affected by the pandemic, you have to react very quickly and take measures to ensure that your trial, number one, is still running smoothly, or you have certain measures to put your trial on hold, to comply with the local situation, and also not to put the participants of the clinical trial, whether they be health professionals, whether they be trial participants, or staff who are involved in the management of the clinical trial, so that you don't put these people at risk. There are some challenges. For example, there are restrictions of visits to the health facilities. So you may have, for example, a clinical trial running, and you may want to send your monitors to monitor the clinical trial. And it could be that the process has been affected by the onset of a pandemic. Also because there is a very high increase in the demand on the health system. So as we have seen in many regions, the health systems and hospitals have been really challenged by the situation. Available medical staff may not be available to carry out your trial as planned. And the experts and the medical professionals may have to redirect their efforts to deal with the ongoing pandemic. So you may have changes to the availability of the trial staff in the hospital. The trial participants may also be required to self-isolate, which make it difficult for investigators to maintain their medical oversight. This could all have an impact on your clinical trials, and especially if you have trials which are ongoing. How do you complete your clinical trial? How do you complete your assessment? How do you complete your visits, trial visits? Do you need to put your trial on hold? Also, another issue to consider, how do you supply your investigational medicinal product? Because there may be some delays or stops in the logistical system, the import and export of your medicine which you want to use for the clinical trial. So for sponsors of clinical trials, you need to have a very quick reaction to the pandemic situation. And we are currently talking about trials which are not specifically to investigate the pandemic virus, the coronavirus, but we are talking about ongoing clinical trials which were hit by the pandemic situation. So for sponsors who are involved in this type of trials or who have been affected by the pandemic situation, you have to have a very rapid response team, very rapid response. You need to make a rapid impact assessment. So you have the impact of the pandemic situation on your trial has to be assessed. So you need to have an impact on the ongoing trials, impact on any new trial sites, because sometimes you have a trial which is ongoing and you plan to initiate new sites which maybe haven't yet been initiated, and then you have been affected by the pandemic situation. So this has to be assessed very thoroughly. Also, you have to assess the impact on any ongoing recruitment and the continued involvement of patients. So some patients haven't been recruited yet. So what does the pandemic situation, how does it affect your recruitment process? On the other hand, what happens to those participants in your trial which have already been recruited? And also the impact on starting any new trials. So if you have a trial which you planned to start, you may want to delay the trial, or you may want to, if you want to start on time, you have to have a very strong impact assessment because during a pandemic situation, you can face so many challenges. This type of impact assessment should take into also into consideration not only factors which could affect your clinical trial, but also the national recommendations, because I already mentioned that the national recommendations and restrictions differ from one country to another. And in some countries, the governments have issued very strict social distancing and measures, social distancing measures, and any other type of restrictions on the movement of people. And in some other countries, like for example in Sweden and Denmark, the governments have decided to have a more linear approach and to rely on the social responsibility of the citizens. So they have informed their citizens of the dangers of the pandemic, but they haven't really imposed any legal restrictions. So if you are carrying out international trial in different locations, you have to pay attention to the national restrictions and the recommendations of the national governments in the countries where you want to carry out your clinical trial. Also, many governments have imposed very tough travel restrictions. For example, in some countries, you are obliged to self-quarantine or quarantine for 14 days after arrival from a different country. So travel restrictions should be taken into consideration, and any period which you need to quarantine before you are allowed to participate, for example, in a clinical trial. There may be some confinement of trial participants and trial staff. You also have to assess the availability of the staff to perform visits. Any other issues which could be affected, like data entry. However, you should always have a system in place if you want to continue your clinical trial to notify serious adverse events. And you have to try to follow the protocol as closely as possible. So it's a very difficult situation for an ongoing trial. So you have to have a very rigorous impact assessment and then decide if you have to take any measures. You have to carry out a risk-benefit analysis, and actions should be proportionate to the risk-benefit considerations which you are taking into consideration. You have to have a contingency plan taken nationally and locally by any authorities, and you should give priority to the impact on the health and safety of the trial participants and any staff which are taking part or involved in the clinical trial. So whatever decisions you make, if you want to continue your clinical trial, or you want to put it on hold, or you want to have some restrictions, or you want to continue, you have to have the safety of all the trial participants as your priority. If a trial participant is unable to attend the site for whatever reasons, you have to have some other measures such as home nursing if possible. And then you have to also ensure that if you do take this route and you do home nursing, that you have the appropriate measures in place to be able to also follow up to ensure reliability of the data which is being produced during the clinical trial. Limitations and risks of such methods and the requirements for data protection should be taken into consideration. So it's not an easy situation if you want to move from a clinical environment. If you want to move from a clinical environment to any other home environment, you have to consider that you may be affecting the reliability of the data which is being generated. Other types of assessments which you need to consider is, for example, do you want to initiate new clinical trials? Now, sponsors usually have a very tight deadline. When you have a project plan and you want to start a clinical trial, you have this, usually you have this already planned many years or months ahead before you start your clinical trial. So if you have a project plan and you intend to start a trial and then you have a pandemic situation, you have to reassess the situation and consider if it is appropriate to initiate a new clinical trial during this pandemic situation. You have to assess the feasibility, and you also have to assess the necessity of starting a new clinical trial. This should be critically assessed by all parties, which is sponsors, any relevant parties, and investigators. Other additional risks should be addressed in a very rigorous risk-benefit analysis. And in addition, if you carry out your risk-benefit analysis, you should also consider mitigation measures. Other things to consider during a pandemic, apart from starting new clinical trials, is of course the ongoing clinical trials. Sponsors should consider their risk assessment, whether the following measures would be appropriate. For example, conversion of physical visits into phone or video visits. Is it possible to do so? Number one. Number two, is it will it have an effect on the reliability of the data which you produce? Is it appropriate perhaps to postpone or complete cancellation of visits to ensure that only strictly necessary visits are performed at the sites? Would doing this affect the data generated, the reliability of the data, and the volume of the data? In certain critical situations, you may have to have a temporary halt of your clinical trial, simply because it's not possible to carry out the trial under the given pandemic situation. You may have to interrupt or slow down the recruitment process. And we all know that clinical trials, you have a protocol and you have very strict timelines. However, in a pandemic situation, this is unforeseen. So you do have to consider the risk benefit, and then you have to consider all these points, like if you could do some of this testing at home, if it is appropriate, will it have an effect on the reliability of your data? Do you need to have a temporary halt to the recruitment process or of the trial? Will the trial be interrupted? Do you need to slow down the recruitment process? And of course, all of this is theoretically would have an effect on your protocol and recruiting period. And all of this has to be taken also into consideration. For the ongoing trials, if you have to have a temporary halt to your trial or recruitment process, you would have to consider also then, do you need to extend the duration of the trial? So if you consider to have 6 months for the recruiting phase, you may have to extend that, because during these 6 months you were not able to recruit the number of patients which you intended to recruit, and because you had to put a halt or you had to temporarily stop your clinical trial. In this pandemic situation, you may also have to consider postponement of some or all of the trial activities, or initiation of new sites, for example. You may have to close certain sites because under the pandemic situation, it may not be appropriate for you to continue testing in certain sites for whatever reason. It may not be feasible. So you have to consider this, and the sponsor should consider if the trial site should be closed and how it can be done without compromising the rights, safety, and well-being of the trial participants. Because we all know that the initiating of a new trial site and closing of a trial site is highly regulated, and you need to have very clear steps, and you need to have everything. You have to have a protocol which describes all the steps which have been done and the data validity of any data which was generated at that site. So you have to consider all these things during your risk assessment. Other things to consider if you have trials running is if it is unavoidable to stop a trial. You may have a justified exceptional situation based on your own benefit risk ratio. You may need to transfer, nonetheless, some of your trial participants to investigational sites which are away from risk zones. So if you have a trial running in a high risk zone and you have some other sites which are less lower risk, you may want to continue with your trial participants, but you may want to move them to another location. This other location could be any location closer to their home or any other trial site. So this is something you have to consider especially for trials which are ongoing. If there is an urgent need to open a new trial site for critical visits, for example, which are outside the hospital, this may be implemented as an urgent safety measure. And we all know that if you want to carry out changes to your clinical trial protocol or your clinical trial plan, you have to inform the authorities about any changes. Some of these may be minor changes, but some of them would in a normal situation be a substantial amendment which needs authority approval. So this makes your clinical trial very difficult to manage in a pandemic situation, because normally for these type of changes you would actually have to carry out a change to your protocol, implement a change, and submit this change to the authorities. And sometimes you would need to also wait for approval for this type of amendment. In the case of an urgent safety measure, it is important that the trial participants and all participants in the trial, including the investigators, all of them are in agreement about the transfer and receiving sites if you want to transfer patients. And any receiving site has the possibility to access any data which was previously collected, including any medical records. So changing the trial site of a patient is not easy, and it is an unusual situation. So we have to make sure that the data integrity is kept and that all processes which are required in this type of change are implemented correctly. The impact on trial participants should be considered and arrangements made, such as providing adequate transportation. Having said that, if you change the site where data is being generated, you may also have, because of the pandemic situation, you may have some critical tests or laboratory tests, such as imaging or other diagnostic tests. And for the trial participant, you have to always consider that the safety and or integrity of the trial data, which is safety of the patient and participants, and the integrity of any data which is being produced. If you have to change the testing site of any tests which are being carried out due to other types of restrictions, you need to consider if this new testing site is also accredited and can carry out the tests according to the standards which you have foreseen previously. In case the trial participant cannot reach the site to have these tests performed, it could be acceptable that the laboratory or this testing be done at a local laboratory. But as I said, you have to pay attention, because usually you already have accredited labs for certain type of tests. And if this is not possible, and if you want to introduce a new testing lab or site, then you need to consider that this new testing site also meets all the legal and regulatory requirements. Especially important to consider if the trial endpoint, the test which you want to carry out is one of the trial endpoints. And if a trial endpoint or a biological sample cannot be shipped to the central lab due to the pandemic situation, then you can do some, especially if you have very critical type of tests, you need to do the test then locally. Then you have to explain the reason why you cannot test at the accredited lab, which was originally planned, and you need to have that justification in your study report. When changes are being carried out for ongoing trials, the main thing you need to consider is the well-being of all trial participants, especially the participants themselves, but also all other actors who are involved in this trial, including personnel at the testing labs, medical practitioners, any hospital staff. All of these have, you need to consider that you do not want to compromise their situation in any way. But at the same time, of course, you would like to have your trial, you would like to continue perhaps carrying out your clinical trial, because stopping the clinical trial could put you at a very big disadvantage, or it may affect the trial results. This is something which all parties involved in a clinical trial have to consider if they want to continue or if they want to stop or put the clinical trial on hold during a pandemic. But if they decide to continue, then they need to put the interest of all participants as their priority. If a trial is halted even temporarily, then this could potentially also compromise the overall well-being and interests of the trial participants. So it's not an easy decision to make during a pandemic. It may be tempting to halt the trial and continue at a later point if the situation is very challenging. However, you have to think also of the interest of the participants in the trial, because you may extend the length of the trial to a period which may not be convenient for the trial participants. In other situations, maybe the trial participants are depending on this medication which you would like to test on them, and so on. So all these type of measures need to be taken into consideration to avoid not putting the or to avoid putting any trial participants at a disadvantage. Other changes to ongoing trials: compliance with the trial protocol should be ensured. So you have a protocol, you have submitted, it has been approved by the local authority, and now during a pandemic you are forced to carry out certain changes to your protocol. If you do so, you have to ensure that any change is being recorded, and you have to carry out, of course, a risk-benefit for the clinical trial and all its participants. The impact of this protocol changes, which normally you would have to notify to the authority or at least get an approval before implementation. This is a very special situation, so we're going to also look at how some authorities are dealing with these type of changes to protocols due to a pandemic situation. So you have to, if you change any parts of your protocol due to the pandemic situation, you have to also investigate what effect this will have on the reliability of the data which you produce or which is being generated in your clinical trial. There is a guidance on the implications of the coronavirus disease on any aspects of ongoing trials. And this was published by the CHMP Biostatistics Working Party, because any changes to your protocol could have an effect on any other part of your trial, especially, for example, sample size. And this guidance gives you some indication of what to do in this type of situation and how it would have an effect on your sample size and the data which is being generated. Other things to think about during a pandemic. if you have an ongoing clinical trial is safety reporting. Now, safety reporting is something which you have to carry out in a normal situation, and this should also continue during the pandemic situation if you want to continue carrying out your clinical trial. So sponsors are expected to continue safety reporting, adherence in the EU, but also in other areas, also during a pandemic. And you should stick to your protocol. And even if the visits are reduced or postponed, you still have to continue collecting any adverse events from the trial as stated in your protocol. You can do this by different means, for example, by phone calls or telemedicine visits and the use of modern technology, but you should continue carrying out or collecting and reporting if required adverse events. The risk assessment, the safety of the trial participants is very important, in particular with the added challenge due to, in this particular case, the COVID-19, but could be any other pandemic. And this should be weighed against anticipated benefit of the trial participants. This should be part of your risk assessment. All decisions to adjust clinical trial conduct should be based on a risk assessment by the sponsor. And all of this is also part of the ICH guidance on risk assessment. It is expected that the sponsor performs a risk assessment of each individual ongoing trial and the investigator of each individual trial and implement measures which are appropriate for your trial participant safety and also to ensure that the validity of any data which is being generated. Part of your risk assessment should always consider that the safety of the participant should always have priority. During the pandemic situation, a sponsor needs to reassess any new risks which develop, because as we have seen during a pandemic, the situation keeps changing every day. Certain governments have imposed new restrictions, certain governments have lifted restrictions, and all of this has to be part of your risk assessment, and you also have to assess the impact of these regulatory changes and legal changes in the different jurisdictions on your clinical trial. This should all be documented and should be part of the sponsor's trial master file. It is possible that with the escalation of the pandemic, local circumstances lead to a local change in risk assessment. And this is very challenging if you have an international clinical trial running, because the local governments have had different approaches to this current pandemic. And so the effect of these different approaches and different restrictions could also have different effects to your international clinical trials. If you have a single protocol, it may have a different effect to your protocol in a different way at the local level. So you may have to implement additional measures, and this should be investigated in your risk assessment. The impact of the current COVID-19 pandemic on trial participants should be determined as part of a risk group for this particular pandemic, who are in trials involving treatments which may increase such risks. And this should all be considered when deciding to continue your clinical trial or your clinical study. If these trials are not addressing the coronavirus itself, the effect of the pandemic or the coronavirus could also negatively affect any trial participants who are taking part in a different type of trial. So this has to be also considered in your risk assessment, putting the safety of the participants as your priority. Now, what about communication with the authorities? We have seen that in a normal situation, you have a clinical trial which is running, and if you want to carry out any changes happen during a clinical trial. So sometimes you need to change the protocol. The protocol has been submitted to the local authority. In most jurisdictions, you need to get an approval. So the authority has approved a certain protocol, and sometimes it's necessary to change parts of your protocol. So in this pandemic situation, certain parts of your protocol will have to be changed, not by intention, but because of the pandemic situation. Nonetheless, some situations are considered to be a substantial change to your protocol. So how do you communicate these changes with the authorities? So the authorities in different jurisdictions have been giving out different types of information and messages to the sponsors of clinical trials, telling them how to act, giving them some guidance. So in most jurisdictions at the moment, the authorities are keen to have new clinical trials addressing the pandemic virus, which is the coronavirus. So priority is given to any new clinical trial application for the treatment or prevention of the coronavirus infection itself. So if you have a clinical trial planned, which is not addressing the coronavirus, you may have to consider if you would like to postpone that clinical trial. We know that companies also have their own timelines, so it is critical for some sponsors that they carry out their trials on time. However, you should consider the risk to all trial participants if your clinical trial is not addressing the coronavirus, and if you would like to postpone it. The governments are giving priority to companies who would like to investigate the coronavirus. Also, some of the clinical trials which are currently running would like to, for example, implement substantial amendments to applications to existing clinical trials as a result of the coronavirus. So these would be given priority. Clinical trials which are addressing the coronavirus, or clinical trials which are ongoing, which you do not want to or cannot stop, but you need to have approval from the authorities for your protocol amendments. So these two types of applications would be given priority, and then all other clinical trials which you would have liked to start, these will be given second or third priority. For ongoing trials, there is a guidance in the EU, for example, on substantial amendments, and this remains applicable also for any amendments you have to carry out due to the pandemic situation. A single submission by the same sponsor with a list of all concerned trials and an aggregated list of changes is acceptable and encouraged in case of substantial amendments, as well as of urgent safety measures, because all of these type of changes in clinical trials which are ongoing, which are not related to the investigation of the coronavirus, most of these substantial amendments will be similar, because the change you are trying to apply for is related to the response of that clinical trial to the pandemic situation. So if you have more than one trial running, most of these responses for the different trials, even though each trial would be individual, would be similar, because you're responding to a particular corona pandemic situation, which is related to, for example, social distancing or quarantining. The other group of applications which are being considered as a priority are, of course, clinical trials which directly want to intend to investigate the coronavirus. Two important aspects need to be taken into account. You can have a change which is substantial when it is a potential impact, which has a potential impact on the safety or physical or mental integrity of the clinical trial participant. So if you have these type of changes for ongoing trials as a reaction to the coronavirus pandemic, this type of change would be considered to be a substantial change, which in normal circumstances would need to have an approval by the local authority. And these are going to be given priority, at least in certain jurisdictions, This particular situation is for the EU, but in other jurisdictions you would have a similar approach. And the second thing to consider is submission of information is only obligatory if an amendment is a substantial amendment, because you have in a normal situation, any minor amendments can be implemented, and then you send this information to the authority as a notification for information purposes only, or you include it in your final report. But substantial amendments need to have an approval by the competent authority. And so this type of amendment, which is a reaction based, which is a substantial amendment, which would normally require approval, would be given priority in this particular situation, because you are reacting to a pandemic situation. Other things to consider in communication with the authorities is you need to have risk assessments, which you need to communicate to the local authorities. And sometimes also you may have to inform the ethics committees. As you know, in most jurisdictions, in all jurisdictions actually, you need to have also an approval not only from the competent authority but from the ethics committee before you can initiate or start a clinical trial. And if you have a substantial amendment, then sometimes you also need to inform the ethics committee if the safety of the patient is put at risk as a result of this change in your protocol. Then you need to also inform the ethics committee. It is possible that urgent actions are required by the sponsor and the investigator to protect trial participants against immediate hazards, and these urgent safety measures do not need to be notified or do not need prior approval or notification, because this is something which you need to do because the participants are at risk. Due to specific local or national circumstances, in a pandemic situation, submission to relevant authorities could take longer than usual, and sometimes because also the authorities need to work from home. So you may have, like in some countries, you have a backlog of applications which may slow down the process. So all of this has to be also taken into consideration. If changes which are substantial amendments do not require immediate action from the sponsor or investigator, these should be submitted as a substantial amendment. So if you need to carry out immediate action, then you can carry it out first, even if it is a substantial amendment. In all other cases, you need to first get prior approvals, and usually also from the ethics committees. Certain procedural or other changes may be necessary due to the pandemic situation, like social distancing, and this is also something which you need to consider in your communication with the authorities. Sponsors are expected to submit to the relevant competent authorities and ethics committee the list of all changes with appropriate risk assessment and justification, as well as follow-up actions when necessary. So anyway, this is just an overview of the different types of changes. You have number one, urgent safety measures, which you need to carry out. So you need to implement them immediately, and then you can inform the authority. Then you have substantial amendments, which you in normal circumstances need to submit, wait for approval, and then implement. And then you have any other measures, which in most cases you don't have to wait for approval. You have to have an agreement, and it's important to have communication between sponsors, trial sites, and the trial participants. Changes to the trial conduct, which are initiated by the sponsor, should be agreed with and communicated clearly to all investigators in the trial, especially during a pandemic situation. You also know you need to have informed consent, and in a pandemic situation, for example, it may not be possible to get informed consent in writing as in a normal situation. So if that is not possible, you need to have some other way of informed consent procedure For example, you can have informed consent by the telephone, but then you need to follow it up later, perhaps in writing. But you need to have a system of how you want to carry out informed consent if it is not possible to do it in the traditional way. If written consent by a participant is not possible, for example, because of physical isolation, then consent should be given orally by the trial participant, and then maybe you can have a witness during this process. And later on, the witness is required to sign and date the informed consent and form. The investigator is expected to record how this was carried out, and they should all be part of your clinical trial documentation. Sometimes, because of the COVID-19 situation or because of the pandemic, a trial participant is incapacitated. Also, what do you do in this particular situation? In some cases, you have acute life-threatening situations also due to the pandemic. And again, you have to think of how you want to deal with informed consent, and maybe you can do this later. Other things to consider. I know we're coming now to almost the end of the hour, so let me just go over these slides a little bit more quickly. You may have changes in your distribution. So it's important to understand that you may have disruption in your supply chain. Other things to consider. You may want to put some large amounts of your investigational medicinal product on stock just to make sure that you have enough for your trial during the pandemic, and any other issues which may affect your distribution chain considering the pandemic situation should be taken into consideration. So this is all related to any challenges which you may face during a pandemic and also the availability of your investigational medicinal products because of the pandemic situation. Also, you should think of any issues relating to blinding. You should use dedicated couriers to ensure that you still have access to your investigational medicinal product during the pandemic situation because of the breakdown in the logistics chain. Changes in the investigational medicinal product distribution are also often associated with additional changes. For example, the visit schedule, protocol, or replacement of physical visits. And all of this has to be communicated to the regulatory bodies and also be part of your clinical trial documentation. Changes also in distribution of any in vitro diagnostic and medical devices which may be part of your clinical trial. Changes to monitoring, as I said, because of social distancing, you may have issues with on-site monitoring, centralized monitoring, or off-site monitoring. So all of this has to also be taken into consideration. Any changes in your audit cycle, also because it may be affected by a pandemic situation. Protocol deviations we already discussed. There could be some amendments which you need to take into consideration. Any increase in protocol deviations due to the COVID-19 situation will not trigger actions, legal actions, because this is a particular situation, but you have to be careful to document everything and submit. Either you act immediately and then submit for approval, or you submit for approval and this will be dealt with in an expedited manner by the competent authority and given priority. Also, any changes in the clinical trial situation as based on the pandemic situation or any in any pandemic situation, these type of expenses usually will be borne by the sponsor. So the sponsor has to expect that during a pandemic situation, there will be an increase in the costs due to the unforeseen situation, and they have to put this in their planning. So I do have some more slides which I would like to share with you. However, because we have come to the end of this presentation or the end of the hour, I would like just to share with you very quickly some approaches, just to give you some idea that in the different regions we do have fast track development and support for trials which are not ongoing, but for trials which are addressing the COVID-19 virus. So the European Medicines Agency has published two guidance documents. Main points is rapid scientific advice, rapid agreement of any pediatric investigational plan, rolling sub review. That means they evaluate your clinical data as it comes in, rapid marketing authorization process, extension of any indication, and compassionate use. So this is the European approach to the situation. And they have published two guidance documents, one for COVID-19, fast track development, and the second one is incentives for the acceleration of development and support and evaluation procedures for COVID-19 treatments and vaccines. I'm not going to go into detail because we're coming to the end of the hour. However, also in China, you do have fast track process in response to the outbreak of this COVID-19 situation. So there is also a fast track process for any clinical trials which are addressing the COVID-19 virus. So you have different, there was one fast track process published in 2005 and one in 2007, and then also another one. So all of these give expedited review to any type of trial which is addressing the coronavirus. And in the FDA in the US also, they have off-label use. So doctors are allowed to use promising medicines which they think could treat the coronavirus off-label. They have a system called emergency use authorization. The authority, they permit the use of unapproved medicinal products or off-label use of medicinal products to diagnose, treat, or prevent serious life-threatening diseases. And this also applies to any type of vaccines which address the coronavirus. They are having an expedited review of any pre-IND corona-related investigational new drug applications. And then they have a so-called expanded access programs, also called compassionate use. So all three regions and in many other jurisdictions, you would have the same approach. In a pandemic situation, there's a rush to investigate different cures for the pandemic, and these will be given priority, and the different jurisdictions do have tools or mechanisms by which companies and sponsors can have a fast track approval process for their clinical trial applications for this type of medicines. And with that, I think I will come to the end of my presentation, and I'll give you some opportunity perhaps to raise some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Salma Michor, for the wonderful presentations. There's been a considerable amount of practical advice from yourself regarding the changes on the ongoing clinical trials during the COVID-19 pandemic, and also the various risk assessments programs applicable as the situation is developing. If you would like to learn more about this presentation, please be reminded that a recording will be sent to you within 3 working days via email. Now we can have 5 more minutes for the Q&A, and another reminder is that you may be sure to type your questions into the question box in the control panel. We have a couple of questions for you, and Dr. Michor, and I believe we can start with a very quick question here first. One of the attendees would like to know that while recruiting new subjects, would it be mandatory to screen them for COVID-19 in the current scenario?
Thank you for that question. Yes, it would be very advisable to do so. But having said that, you also have to consider the local legal situation. So please also consider that you may have to screen them. But if it is not a local legal requirement, you would be well advised to do so.
Thank you, Dr. Michor. There's another researcher from an institute with this question. And I think one of the questions has already been answered at the beginning of the presentation regarding the differences in the maximum and minimum time limit for the conduct of clinical trials. He would like to understand better if there are any specific guidelines given by FDA, EMA, DGA, etc. On this time limit.
Yes, I have mentioned that the European agency has published 2 guidelines, and there's one specific one also on the duration of the trial.
Thank you. And there's one more interesting question coming from exactly the same attendee. Are there any special regulations for the collection of samples from COVID-19 patients? My apologies. It's a very new environment right here. So let's say if you are conducting a clinical trial, not about COVID-19 vaccines, are there any special regulations for the collection of samples if the patient is under quarantine but not positive yet, or if the patient is under quarantine and already tested positive, and or if the treatment has already been done but the patient is still negative?
I didn't really understand the question correctly, but I think I can my answer could be, theoretically, because this is a new situation, this has to be part of, this cannot be answered during this session. This has to be part of your risk assessment. This is a new situation. You have a clinical trial running. This was not part of your initial risk assessment. Now you have a new situation. Now you have a COVID-19 situation, a pandemic situation. So you have to, number one, look at the local legal requirements. Like in some jurisdictions, they are very strict about who has to be tested. So you have to comply, first of all, with the legal legislation. And number two, you need to carry out a new risk assessment, taking exactly these points into consideration.
Thank you, Dr. Michor. Do we have any final question for Dr. Michor? There's another question for you. A volunteer is being recruited for a particular trial that is not related to COVID-19, but later on found to be positive for COVID-19. Are there any special advice or guidelines to be followed?
No, currently there are no guidelines. They are just from the European agency, and the FDA mostly is addressing fast-track procedures of how to register clinical trials. The European agency has published these guidelines on ongoing clinical trials. So that would be at least a document which you can address, and this type of question could be tackled by reading that guidance. But this type of situation, if you have a patient is found to be positive, there is no specific guidance, because as you say, innovation happens quicker than regulation and guidance. So till you publish a guidance, the patient has already been tested positive. So this has to be part of your risk assessment. And you have to consider these issues and make a risk benefit if you want to, for example, continue your clinical trial, if you want to halt, if you think the risk is too high, the patients may be infected, what to do with this type of patient who has been infected. You have to have that in your risk management or risk assessment.
Thank you, Dr. Michor. I think COVID-19 is a relatively large topic, and there's a lot of questions to be asked. There's a lot of considerations that you need to take during your risk assessments, either on your non-COVID-19 clinical trial projects or for your clinical trial projects for your COVID-19 vaccines drug discovery program. It's a large topic, and had we been given more time, Dr. Michor would have been able to cover more interesting topics. For example, the data integrity, data transparency, data privacy, financial transparency, and the applications of the technologies on clinical trials, and what's the interplay with the regulatory affairs. There's a lot that you may be able to learn from the expertise that Dr. Michor has. And please do feel free to draw for us more questions after this webinar if you would like to have. Dr. Michor, is there anything you would like to convey to the attendees before we close the presentation?
Yes, I think, 1 hour is not really a long time to cover all the topics, and there are so many questions and so much uncertainty surrounding this new pandemic situation. So anyway, we do plan, is it a 4-day, half-day event in June, where we do cover many more topics? Is that right, Tony? It's a four-day event, half-day event.
Yes, 4 half-days events.
Yeah, so that maybe we'll have some more time to cover some more topics, and it is a very big challenge, especially for ongoing trials, but also for new clinical trials. So any of you who are working in this area and have any more questions, maybe you would be interested to attend the 4-day session or 4-day event in June.
Thank you, Dr. Michor. Again, to our attendees, this presentation will be uploaded on the basis of a recorded version and delivered to you via email within 3 working days from today on. And please stay tuned to your email for the recorded version of this presentation. Again, we remain open if you have any additional questions to Dr. Michor, and we'll be connecting you to her in the near future. Thank you, Dr. Michor, again for your time and preparation of this wonderful presentation. Please, for everyone, please do remember to help us fill in the post-webinar survey being sent to you. We would love to improve and increase the intensity and the value from our webinars in the future. Thanks again for joining us today, and we'll be seeing you next time. Take care and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.